The Sony Xperia XA has a beautiful edge-to-edge display, which would lead you to think it was Sony's 2016 flagship phone. Instead, that honor goes to the underwhelming Xperia X, where the Xperia XA was Sony's mid-range phone. With almost non-existent bezels, it's a mystery why Sony didn't employ this attractive design on the Xperia X. The Xperia doesn't have a fingerprint sensor, but it looks more expensive than its £240 price tag. The XA can now be found for as low as £170 on Amazon. With its smooth, soft touch rear and gently rounded corners, the XA is one of Sony's most comfortable to hold smartphones to date. Display. It's a shame, then, that the XA's 5in 1,280x720 display is nowhere near as good as those used in rest of Sony's 2016 smartphones. Covering just 81.3% of the sRGB color gamut, it simply doesn't have the same depth of color as the Xperia X, and it even falls behind the Xperia M5, Sony's other mid-range handset we reviewed earlier in the year, which covered 92.2%. This is a real shame, as Sony's displays have consistently been one of its key strengths. Sadly, the XA also lags behind on brightness, topping out at 407.43 CD/M2. This is by no means terrible, and still just about good enough to see the screen clearly outdoors in direct sunlight, but when the Xperia X, M5, and even 2014's M4 Aqua all broke 500 CD/M2, the XA once again feels quite dull by comparison. Contrast was reasonably good and I measured a ratio of 1,119:1, so at least you get a decent gradient between lights and darks. Battery life. I suspect Sony had good reason for curtailing the screen's maximum brightness, as a brighter screen would have used more power and reduced battery life further. Its 2,300 mAh battery might possibly be a bit on the small side compared to other mid-range smartphones, but even setting the screen brightness to our standard measurement of 170 CD/M2 only yielded a rather pitiful battery life score of 7 hours 12 minutes in our continuous video playback test. This just isn't good enough in this day and age, especially when you've got budget phones that are half the price of the XA, such as the Vodafone Smart Prime 7, the Moto G 3rd Gen, and Samsung Galaxy J5, regularly exceeding at least 10 hours under the same conditions. Performance. The one thing the XA does have on its side, however, is speed. With an octa-core 2.0 GHz MediaTek MT6755 processor and 2 GB of RAM at its disposal, the XA feels silky smooth in day-to-day use, and Sony's version of Android 6.0.1 rarely lagged or tripped over itself. Bizarrely, our usual Geekbench 3 benchmarks kept crashing when I tried to run them on the XA. This chipset puts the Xperia XA roughly on a par with the £170 Moto G4. However, comparing it something closer to its £240 price, and I can confidently say it's outclassed by the absurdly quick OnePlus 2, which costs £250. All of this isn't really a major issue, though, as speed in Android isn't the Xperia XA's issue. In fact, it's the one area, alongside its design, that I'm perfectly happy with. Our graphics tests had no benchmarking issues. This time, we're certain the Xperia XA's on the back foot, as its 445 frames in GFX Bench GL's off-screen Manhattan 3.0 test only equates to around 7.2 FPS, putting it a long way behind the OnePlus 2's 1396 frames and 2.3 FPS average. In practice, it's not nearly as bad as it sounds, for while complex games like Hearthstone were a tad jerky in places, it wasn't really bad enough to make me stop playing at any point. Simpler games like Threes also ran perfectly fine, so you shouldn't have too much trouble running most of your favorite games. Camera. Another saving grace of the Xperia XA is its rear 13-megapixel camera. While the Xperia XA's camera left me distinctly unimpressed, the XA's sensor managed to produce smooth, natural-looking shots that were almost entirely devoid of the noise and grain that plagued the XA's 23-megapixel camera. Areas of fine detail were, perhaps, a little soft for my liking, with brickwork often blurring together and paving stones fading into obscurity, but on the whole, images were well exposed, had great color reproduction and plenty of contrast. That said, I'd recommend switching to the camera's manual mode and enabling HDR where possible, as this produced much brighter, more vivid photos than the default superior auto mode. Results were a little more mixed with our indoor test shots, but again, they were much better than what I managed with the Xperia X. Admittedly, noise started to creep in when our studio lights were turned off, resulting in some rather smeary patches of detail in our still life arrangement, but this improved greatly once I'd switched them on, so you should be able to take some pretty decent shots provided you've got enough light. Conclusion. Ultimately, the Xperia XA's mediocre screen and diabolical battery life just aren't good enough to recommend it. Had Sony mashed the Xperia X and Xperia XA together, marrying the XA's edge-to-edge screen design and camera sensor with the X's more accurate display, faster processor, and longer-lasting battery, it might have created a great smartphone. On their own, though, they both have too many flaws to be recommended. However, given the phone can be found a lot cheaper now, it's still worth considering. If you're buying SIM-free, you'd be much better off getting the OnePlus 2 at this price, but if you're after a contract, then your next best bet is the superior Samsung Galaxy S5 Neo, which has a great display and brilliant battery life. Admittedly, it doesn't look as nice, but you won't be complaining when the S5 Neo is getting you that late-night taxi when the XA's battery would have been completely drained.